I'm just going to test this one more time for our online speaker. Tony, can you hear us?
Hello, yes, I can hear you fine. Apologies, everyone, but unfortunately, my video doesn't seem to be working. There's a Zoom issue here, but I am here.
Okay, that's perfect. Welcome. We can't see you, but we can hear you here. So we will get started then, and apologies for the slight delay. Sometimes technology, unfortunately, fails us ever so slightly. But I'd like to welcome you all here to the European Policy Centre for this event. It is the final event of the Task Force on the European Health Union, EU Health in a Post-Pandemic Era. My name is Danielle Brady, and I'm a policy analyst here at the European Policy Centre, and I'll be moderating this morning's discussion. I'm delighted to be joined here both online, as you are now all very well aware, and in person by a wonderful panel. So beside me here on my right, I have Elisabetta Zanon, who's the Director of EU Public Affairs and Advocacy at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Antonio Estrella is joining us online, and he's an author and strategic futurist. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Elisabetta Kuiper, who's Associate Director and Head of Social Europe and Wellbeing Programme here at the European Policy Centre. And last but not least, by Philippe Brunet, who's a Senior Advisor and a former Head of Cabinet at the European Commission. So I'm very delighted to be joined by these speakers here this morning, and equally delighted to be joined by each of you who have joined us here in the room. As I mentioned, this is the final event of the Task Force of the European Health Union. And this task force was established in autumn 2022 by the European Policy Centre with the support of a number of partners, including Amgen, Citra, EIT Health, MSD, and Johnson & Johnson. And the idea behind establishing this task force was to gather relevant stakeholders together and to discuss and assess the proposals of the European Health Union, and to discuss indeed the future of health in Europe and how stakeholders saw the future of health and the role that the EU can play as we move forward. And of course, now we've moved into a post-pandemic era. So the questions we wanted to know is what can health in the EU look like in this era, particularly in the context of the upcoming European elections and the new mandate of the European Commission. So using the input from various stakeholders, which include representatives from the European Commission, members of the European Parliament, industry, patient organisation, healthcare organisation, and academia, we here at the European Policy Centre, myself and Elisabeth, authored a publication which set out recommendations. And those recommendations were informed by the opinions of the various people in the room, but they are the recommendations of the European Policy Centre. And this morning is an opportunity for us to present the report, which is available, some hard copies down there at the right hand at the bottom of the room, and it's also available online. And at this morning's event, Elisabetta will present some of the key takeaways and findings from that paper. And then we will move on to a further discussion with the other people here in the room and also with us online about the future of health in the EU. There will also be opportunity for everyone in the room to ask questions. So I would ask that you have your questions ready for after the panelists have their intervention. So I will firstly pass the floor over to Elisabetta for her presentation of the policy paper.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and good morning to all of you. It's good to be back after the rentrée to see you at the European Policy Centre for what's, I think, going to be an interesting season, also in light of the political developments and the elections ahead. And indeed, as you said, Danielle, of course, EU health in a post-pandemic era is a very important topic. And for me personally, I think it's a topic that really keeps me reflecting since 2010, since I arrived in Brussels. Because I remember still after the H1N1 pandemic, as it was called back then, that indeed coming to Brussels meant that the then Belgian presidency, so that's now exactly 13 years ago, had requested the European Commission to come up with a joint procurement instrument, as member states had learned during that pandemic. And I think it's fair to say that the scale of that pandemic wasn't as big as COVID turned out, but member states had requested the European Commission to work on a joint procurement instrument that they then eventually presented by 2013. But it's really interesting, and I guess the point of all of this is to say that momentum in health really depends on the political will of member states, and also that healthcare policy is often shaped by crisis, because even though since 2013 the instrument of joint procurement existed, member states a majority hadn't really been using the instrument till, of course, March 2020, when the pandemic started. Then, of course, and again, for me, it felt a bit as a déjà vu, having been active in healthcare policy making and politics, that indeed the questions that were being asked back in 2010 and before were the same questions that came up again. And in that respect, I think the European Health Union seems to be about a definition. Is the European Health Union the way the Commission defines it, with the building blocks they presented, the cancer plan, the pharmaceutical strategy, of course, the pandemic preparedness and the proposals that gave more competences to the European Medicines Agency and the European Centre for Disease Control, or is it more than that? And I think it's fair to say that in today's world, with a lot of interconnected problems, think about the geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, where also there's an important health element. Think about inflation, what it means for different sectors and for different stakeholders in sectors. Think about the intersection between planetary health, human health, animal health. I think it's needless to say that health is really important and should be high on the agenda of the institutions. Not just now, but also going forward in light of the elections. But in that respect, it's interesting to look back, since we're now the day prior to the State of the Union, to look back at the role of health in the State of the Union, because that tells you something about its momentum. And it's no surprise that in 2020, just a few months after the start of the von der Leyen Commission, when Commission President von der Leyen was confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic, when she started research for a vaccine, when indeed the world was confronted with isolation, with this big question about how to deal with the pandemic, that then health was very high on the agenda and was very important in light of the State of the Union. And it came after President Macron had called for une Europe de la santé, which was very interesting given the position of bigger member states in the past, where bigger member states, and I'm sure that we're going to speak about it in the debate later on, had oftentimes blocked further development in healthcare because of the fact that then, of course, it leads to competences discussions about spending at EU level. So in that respect, the fact that the French president had mentioned that we need une Europe de la santé, and that von der Leyen decided to take that on in her State of the Union in 2020 was very important. The year after, when Europe was basically getting gradually out of lockdown, the vaccine had been developed, it was, of course, still important. Vaccination was mentioned as a very important part of the State of the Union. HERA was being brought up, the need for an agency or a division of the Commission, because by then that wasn't decided yet, to be dealing with pandemic preparedness. So again, it was still important because officially Europe was still, and the world globally was still in this global pandemic. By 2022, however, the world had changed considerably. Not only because of the geopolitical tensions, but also due to the fact that health clearly had taken a lesser role because only mental health was mentioned. And as important as that is, it's interesting and it tells you something about its momentum and its importance in the broader context. Because if you think about that, we speak a lot about economic security, about dependencies of certain sectors on other parts of the world. You would expect that health security also would be a topic that we would discuss and debate oftentimes, but it's not the case. So in that respect, having this event the day prior to the State of the Union, I personally, and I'm sure that all of us share that feeling. I'm very curious what will be in tomorrow's State of the Union and to what extent health will figure in the State of the Union. So that's to say that indeed, as Danielle pointed out, together with our partners, EIT Health, Citra, Amgen, Johnson Johnson, and MSD, and all the stakeholders involved, indeed ranging from patient organizations to the industry, healthcare stakeholders, we have been reflecting on the question how to define a health union. Is it indeed the building blocks that the Commission presented? And as the Commission points out, we now have a health union, or is it more to that? And as you see, we came up with 9 building blocks. And for the sake of discussion, I'm not going to go to them in length, but I think it's important to stress that in the discussions we had and in the closed door meetings we had, we focused on 3 particular elements. We started with holistic policymaking. And I think for healthcare, as for all policies, but I think particularly for healthcare, that's a very important point to stress. Because after all, the various national and EU policies that we have remain fragmented. And even though we have seen with COVID-19 that now we have more instruments like the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we have now HERA as part of the European Commission, where there is indeed also more focus, more formally on pandemic preparedness, there's more competences, there's much more budget, but still health policy remains fragmented. And in that respect, it's very important to ensure that the intersection between health, planetary health, animal health, human health, but also health and research, health and innovation, health and the green agenda are being seen in a more synergetic way and remain less fragmented. So in that respect, I think it goes without saying that one of the recommendations we wanted to make also touched on the structure of the European Commission. We know that indeed, looking back, the structure of the European Commission and the place of health in the European Commission has been debated oftentimes in the past. So therefore, we would like to propose a vice president for the well-being economy. And of course, I think what's in the title, I think there has been a lot of discussion about the current title of the vice president for promoting the European way of life. I think it's fair to say that perhaps not all stakeholders, not everyone in Brussels was fairly convinced of that title. So why not replacing it by a vice president for well-being that also then would oversee all the areas I just mentioned, ensuring that indeed health also is being, as it already is, but part of the European semester, but then the European semester is also linked to the European Pillar of Social Rights, and that again, there is much more of a holistic approach. Especially with the future of the Green Deal at stake and also the big question about what is going to be the follow-up of the Green Deal, health needs to be more prominent as part of the Green Deal. And again, also when it comes to the internal way of structuring the Commission services, it will be very important that also that is indeed being taken up. Also because of the big issues we're facing because of changing demographics. And again, I think Danielle already looking at times, I will speed up a little bit the recommendations, but you see that it's a wealth of information that we have been discussing these last 1.5 years. Because again, an aging population also means an aging workforce. And we have seen during COVID that indeed the workforce is already under pressure, a lot of pressure. So we need upskilling, reskilling, and we need to focus at European level, despite the very different systems we have in place, at focusing on the health workforce to prepare our healthcare system accordingly. Crisis preparedness and protecting the health of citizens is, of course, a very important part of where the Union needs to focus going forward, not just because of coming pandemics, but also because of the big question to do with access to medicines. It is important that we now have HERA as part of the Commission, and it's also great today that we have a representative from HERA here in the room. But the question is for the evaluation for HERA that will be upcoming in 2024, would it not be better to elevate it to an agency? Are there not tensions between the current way of dealing between DG Santé and DG HERA? And in terms of crisis, would it not provide more clarity if HERA were to be an independent agency like the other agencies? But also, do we not need more investment in health? Because we've seen that, again, at national level, especially when it comes, and this is just one example, to the wide divergences in access to medicines, that there is a lot of differences between member states when it comes to when and at what stage medicines are being taken up. And it's fair to say that also when it comes to the investment in health, there are a lot of member states that do not manage to get to the threshold of enough investment and enough GDP to provide for certain medicines and certain innovation to be taken up at national level. And I know, and again, I'm sure that some of the stakeholders will mention it, that depends on the political will of member states. Are they ready to invest more in health? I'm going to end with a third building block, which is about the EU's place in the world. A lot is being said, again, when it comes to energy dependency and the current geopolitical context about strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy, as we have seen at the start of the pandemic, with masks arriving from China and the EU recognizing that it was dependent on other parts of the world, it is also really important in light of the interconnected challenges the EU is facing to speak about health security as a much broader definition and to ensure that all the challenges we're facing, we're preparing for as the EU. Because we know that there is a lot of discussion about global dynamics, multilateral relations with the US, with China, and how the EU positions itself on that. We had President von der Leyen here at the same podium a few months ago with her speech about de-risking but not decoupling. So in all of that, we need to think about what is health and how do we position the health sector in all of that to ensure that on the one hand, access to medicines in Europe is being granted for patients, but on the other hand also, and that is in line with the Verdun Declaration, that Europe remains a global leader in innovation and R&D. And I think for us as European citizens, that is very important to reflect on. So I think, Danielle, with that, I haven't, justified the depth of all recommendations, but I'm sure that we're going to discuss them in the conversation we're having now.
Oh, thank you very much. And it was a wonderful overview. And to get more of the detail of what Elisabetta was speaking about, you can, of course, have a read of the publication. So I'm now going to pass the floor over to Elisabetta. And Elisabetta, reflecting on the recommendations that are outlined in the paper, and as we move towards the 2024 elections and the next mandate of the Commission, what, in your opinion, do you think should be the priorities for the EU when it comes to health? And what do you see as the main challenges, perhaps, in the adoption of those priorities?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on the European Health Union. So it's really appreciated to have this opportunity, and it's really very, very timely with the European election also coming up in a little bit less than 1 year now, and of course the appointment of the new European Commission after that. I would like to start with a quick taking stock of what happened during the current mandate, because of course the current mandate in terms of health priorities was really not, let's say, business as usual, was very, very different compared to a typical mandate, completely dominated by COVID, with a very strong focus on health priorities due to the pandemic. And this led, of course, to a series of different initiatives being taken in health, which were not expected as part of, let's say, the planning for that mandate. You mentioned them, Elisabetta, so the new competencies of ECDC, new competencies for the European Medicines Agency, the regulation on cross-border health threats, of course, the joint procurement of COVID vaccines. So all this was completely new and very much something which happened in a moment of a crisis. But I would like to stress the fact that the competencies of the EU in the field of health has not really changed. Of course, we have remained to a situation where the competencies are very, very similar to what we had before. And because of that, I feel a bit, I say, uncomfortable with this terminology of a European Health Union. I think that this terminology is more sort of aspirational somewhat. It's an ambition more than really a reality in terms of what we can expect. And this, for me, will have implications on what we can see in the next mandate. I'm not saying that we will go back to, necessarily having health being considered, let's say, secondary type of priority in terms of the work of the European Commission going forward, but somewhat, let's say, I do not expect what happened during the current mandate to replicate at all in the next mandate. What I would also like to stress is the fact that on top of, let's say, what happened during the reaction to the COVID pandemic, the range of measures which were taken at the EU level because of the pandemic, we also had a number of ambitious initiatives in the current mandate. We had, of course, the revision of the legislation on blood, tissues, and cells. We have seen, it's still ongoing, of course. We had the proposal on the European health data space, which again is still in the decision-making process. We have seen, of course, the mental health plan being released, and the cancer action plan as well. And finally, the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation. And I have to say that because of the pandemic, we have seen a slowdown in the development of some of these proposals, some of the proposals in these areas which were expected at an earlier stage during the mandate, in fact, happened relatively late. And this is particularly the case for the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, with the proposals being released by the Commission only in April, so, sorry, just a few months ago. And this means that there is somewhat quite some unfinished business in the current mandate, which will have to be taken forward over the coming years. Of course, the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, this is a huge file, very, very complex, which has also generated, I would say, quite some debates in terms of the approach being proposed by the European Commission for the revision of the legislation. And also, we will have to see whether the European health data space will be finished in this mandate, or if it will, let's say, be taken forward in the next mandate. Even, let's say, if the European health data space is concluded, in any case, the implementation of the European health data space will be extremely challenging, and there will be quite a lot of work also to dedicate on the implementation of legislation which has been agreed at EU level. And this is not just the European health data space, if it is agreed, but of course is also pieces of legislation which was agreed quite some time ago. Medical devices, we are still, let's say, struggling a bit in relation to the implementation of the medical devices regulation. So there is still a lot of work to be done in this area. Equally, health technology assessment, quite a lot of work also in the implementation of the health technology assessment regulation. And I would like to stress the fact that the European Commission has limited capacity. We have seen really the teams in the European Commission being, let's say, struggling somewhat with the amount of work to be dedicated in the implementation phase of these different pieces of legislation. So in other words, I would like to stress the huge task that there is still ahead of us in terms of ensuring that what started some time ago, in some cases, some years ago, in some other cases, what was proposed more recently can be implemented properly. And let's say we can end up having, good legislation implemented in an appropriate way, rather than starting new things without finishing the ongoing job as in a good manner. Nevertheless, of course, we expect a range of new topics to be proposed in the next mandate, and certainly we can expect, or let's say this is my personal opinion only, of course, but certainly I would expect initiatives to continue in the field of what was defined by the European Commission, the 3 A's, affordability, access, availability. Starting with availability, we have seen a lot of political pressure by some countries under the leadership of Belgium in relation to what you mentioned before, strategic autonomy, ensuring that we will not end up in a situation as during the pandemic, struggling in terms of the supply of medicine. There has been this call by a number of member states to develop a critical medicines act. I think that there will be quite a lot of pressure, I say, on the European Commission to do something in this area. Today, we have 40% of pharmaceutical ingredients coming from China. If we look at the situation globally, it's 40%. And clearly, we are in a situation where, you know, during the pandemic, we have seen the, I would say, the fragility of the supply chain in the field of pharmaceuticals. So improving our strategic autonomies, ensuring that we are less reliant on other parts of the world, especially if, you know, politically these other parts of the world, maybe, you know, they are not, they don't reassure us, let's say, in terms of what may happen going forward. It's something which I think would be probably quite important in terms of priority during the next mandate. Other areas of possible developments that we may see in the next mandate are related to the other 2 A's, access and affordability. And I have seen quite some work happening in terms of looking at the Transparency Directive. And the Transparency Directive is old. If I remember well, it dates of '89. So probably it's time to, you know, to relook into that again. There was an attempt several years ago to revise that legislation. It failed. We are here in an area where I say the borderline between EU competencies and national competencies, you know, is really a thin line. So clearly an area where it is difficult to take forward the initiative and to arrive to an agreement at EU level, a bit like, you know, health technology assessment, where we have seen really these, let's say, tension somewhat between EU responsibilities and national responsibilities. Other areas where we may see actions are around unmet medical needs and high unmet medical needs, where we have seen in the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation a lot of, I would say, focus on that with new criteria or definition for both unmet medical needs and high unmet medical needs, with somewhat, I would say, a reaction by some stakeholders showing that they would prefer a more, I would say, a more holistic approach in these definitions. So we may expect possibly some work around that in the new mandate. And also around rare diseases. We have seen a lot of push by some patient groups in more actions around their rare diseases. So I think these are areas where potentially we could see some movements during the next mandate. Now, if I look at, let's say, my perspective as someone who works for the most innovative sector of medicine, the sector of cell and gene therapies, what personally myself and my organization would like to see is more focus on innovation. We are under the impression that somewhat also in the pharmaceutical, in the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, not enough emphasis has been put on ensuring that innovation remains in Europe, ensuring that a lot of investment in innovation will continue to happen in Europe in the future. And we would like somewhat to see a bit, you know, this to be better reflected in the priorities of the European Union. If I explain a bit about the sector of cell and gene therapies, I don't know how familiar our audience is on this. We are talking of a sector which is extremely different compared to traditional medicine. We are not looking at managing symptoms. We are looking at addressing the root cause of diseases. So, for example, to correct genetic defects, which means that potentially these therapies can be curative, can be certainly transformative, give hope to patients who have tried everything. You know, there is absolutely nothing left for them, or for whom, in fact, there has never been any therapy available at all in terms of, you know, clearly areas of very high unmet medical needs, underserved clinical areas. They are transformative. They come with a very high price, and the very high price is also because they will replace, let's say, a treatment, an ongoing treatment over a longer period of time. Often these therapies are administered only once, so it's a single administration, and then the durability is very, very long. But our healthcare systems are really not, let's say, prepared for this disruptive innovation, because they continue to think with the traditional medicine in mind. So somewhat we have science which has developed much quicker compared to the reforms that we have seen in our healthcare systems. So ideally, we would like to see more reflection, more work, also facilitated by the European Commission, to look at how these therapies, these innovative therapies, can be embedded in healthcare systems. Because if we don't do that, I think that increasingly we will see this innovative sector of medicine flourishing in other parts of the world, notably in the United States, but not really developing in Europe, and ultimately this therapy is not reaching patients. We see already a decline in the competitiveness of Europe. Europe was the first to approve a gene therapy back in 2012. Before that, some cell therapies, but let's say it has been a pioneer, it has been a leader in this field, but we see that from the competitive side, we are really losing ground in terms of number of therapeutic developers, clinical trials, in terms of the level of investment. So somewhat, if we want to ensure that the patients in Europe will benefit from these innovative therapies in the future, and especially at an early stage in clinical trials, without having to wait for approvals by the FDA, in case, you know, there will be no approval in Europe, we really need to do something. Otherwise, Europe will miss out from these transformative therapies. And I stop here because I think I have spoken for too long, but I can cover the aspect of the obstacles later on.
Yes, we can come back to that and maybe look at challenges and obstacles in more depth later. But thank you very much for that overview and for discussing what you think should be the priorities. And I think it will definitely be essential that we also put in place what we've also started with in the next mandate. And there are question marks over, will the European Health Union actually be completed by the time we get to the end of this mandate, particularly with the European Health Data Space and the pharmaceutical strategy, which look, particularly the latter, unlikely to go through the legislative process by the elections or the period beforehand. But you also spoke about the global nature of health as well, and you alluded to that and the importance for Europe's place in the world and for access for European citizens. But Antonio, I'm going to turn to you now. I'm delighted to be able to see you now as well, which is great. So coming from the global perspective that you have, how do you see the EU and the European Health Union in addressing global health threats? Because as we know, health doesn't exist within a vacuum within the continent of Europe or the European Union, but expands much broader than that. And do you believe that there's a willingness to increase cooperation at the global level, taking into account the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? Global partners have been identified as being important in our EPC paper for the future of the European Health Union. But in your opinion, what should the key areas be for any such cooperation with international actors, and which partnerships should be prioritized? So I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you, everyone, for the invitation to speak to you. Apologies, I couldn't be there in person, but as I said to Danielle, I have to be in Cambodia to facilitate a workshop with the public-private sector on cancer. So couldn't be in two places at once. That session's coming up tomorrow. So in regards to my point of view here, I guess maybe a little bit of backdrop is that I've been fortunate to have the experience of working in the US, Europe, and across Asia in a variety of roles, from startups and entrepreneurship and investment to working in global multinationals, and now working with public and private stakeholders to drive change in personalized health and health equity. And in reading the paper, in looking at and listening to the comments that have been made so far, a few things have stood out to me. Now, when Elisabetta and I first met, we met at the TEDAS event, and the focus on data strategy and how the 23 member states who participated in that program really coming together to try to develop a thought approach as to what it means to have a global data standard, and not just as a thought exercise, but as something that could be implemented as a strategy. So that's something that continues to stand out to me. A second thing that I heard today was in coming up with this recommendation of having leadership, not for healthcare, but for well-being, to me is important because it talks about the shift of not thinking only about sick care, but in looking at the shift to prevention. And then Elisabetta's, your comments and conversations on innovation also stood out to me. So where I wanted to start with answering your question, Danielle, was some comments on where has Europe led in the past. And this is broader than in healthcare, but I think is important because one of the things that I've learned, and I'm currently researching and writing a book on health equity and the role of health impact in ESG, is that we can learn a lot in the healthcare sector from what's been already accomplished in other areas and industries. And GDPR is the first that stands out to me. And this comes from the conversations that we've had around data and seeing what TEDAS wants to accomplish. Europe's actions in being able to move from what was a fairly early data protection directive in 1995 to now having the fully adopted GDPR regulation that was done in 2016 was a massive industry shift in the world of digital media. One of my businesses that I built and ran was a television network for health. And at the time that we were building that was the time that you see companies like Facebook and Google and YouTube and others really developing their platforms that were driving transformative change in the media sector. And what Europe really helped to drive, which exists today, is the focus on protecting the end needs of individuals and their digital lives, but while still allowing for the continuation of all the benefits that are provided in the digital world, whether it's commerce, whether it's information sharing, whatever it might be. The leadership that Europe demonstrated in GDPR, to me, is something that stands out as a way that the member states and policy can come together to not stifle, but rather enable while creating the right level of protection. And as a second example, I think we can look at, in the automotive sector, the focus on safety that Europe helped to lead. Now, you can go and Google and do a whole set of searches around what are the innovations and changes that really drove safety. Now, the ones that stand out are the fact that Volvo, through their work and their emphasis on safety, were the ones who first introduced 3-point seatbelts. They introduced airbags, the policy decisions that were made around making seatbelts mandatory. You read a book by Stephen Johnson on longevity, the adoption and implementation and regulations of implementation of safety belts are the single largest contribution to longevity in the automotive sector because of the change in the mentality and the outcomes that a car accident, however small or large, did not necessarily lead to a mortality event. And so those to me stand out as two examples of where Europe has led in the past. And so when we apply that to healthcare, I think that in the recommendations of what the paper has brought together, there's three things that stand out. Number one is Europe has been very good at providing a level of focus on equity and data privacy, going back to GDPR, is that every individual matters. And so having a leadership approach in population health where equity and every individual matters and data privacy are at the core is an area where Europe can really drive leadership. I live in Singapore, and the conversations I've had around ASEAN and Southeast Asia and some of the things that are happening here, the learnings from the TEDAS event have really stood out a lot to many, many people that I've spoken with. A second area is in data trends, which is identifying future threats. And I really like the suggestion around having HERA be more predictive in epidemic forecasting. And I think that if that does come to fruition in any form, whether it happens in the way that's recommended in this white paper or in others, being able to be more predictive at a global level would be incredibly transformative. And then the last is technology. And the one thing I want to comment on in technology and innovation is that disruptive technologies does not necessarily mean expensive technologies. There's an initiative in Asia called Precision Public Health that is driven in Southeast Asia by National University of Singapore and a variety of private sector stakeholders, including organizations like Google and Roche. And the emphasis there is that innovation to help drive precision and personalization, even at a incremental level, can be done with a focus of optimization and reallocation as opposed to increased costs. And I think that's important as a philosophy. So I'll make one more comment here, and then I will pause and turn it back over to you, Danielle, which is your question on global partnerships. Those are extremely important in being able to drive change. And the comment I'd make here around what Europe can do in being able to establish leadership is that Europe is the home and headquarters to many global multinationals in healthcare. And in my work globally, one thing that is fairly consistent is that you can innovate and deploy regionally. You can connect with end consumers very locally, but you need to be focused on headquarters to really shape strategy that is holistic around driving global transformation. And to be able to have a standard approach and guidance on how to convert the pain points of individual stakeholders in the private sector and the public sector, and create an approach to align those and find common ground and identify actionable programs that can be addressed under a time horizon of 1 to 3 years and up to 10 years would be incredibly valuable for what can happen and what is needed in Europe.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony, for those remarks. And it's really good to get the global perspective as well on health in Europe and what the EU can do. And turning now to you, Philippe, we've heard what different speakers think that the priorities should be for the EU in the next mandate and in the years ahead. But considering your experience working on health in the Commission, do you see a trend towards more health, or will the new mandate likely bring a return to the pre-pandemic status quo where health was not really a priority at the EU level? And then also secondly, health is, as we've heard, already deeply connected to other areas. For example, climate policy is one example, which is of great importance to a strategy of open strategic autonomy for competitive sustainability for the health sector. But do you see a broader understanding of the importance of health in the current political context? So I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. That will allow me to put back my hat of head of cabinet, or ex-head of cabinet of health commissioner, so that you will see my contribution will be a bit more, less enthusiastic maybe than the previous one. First of all, I would like to say that I've heard the word of Macron, Europe de la Santé. I did not quite understood what he was meaning. That's not the only subject, by the way. The second point, the response of von der Leyen, still for me quite unclear. I would like just for the people having in mind the history of Europe, one minister just after the Schuman Declaration, one minister of the Fourth Republic in France, Paul Ribert, launched a plan which was called l'Europe Blanche. Even at that time, it was to realize, but just for the health structure like hospitals, something which at the end of the day was the pooling of all the different health-related structures throughout Europe. But when we talk about health in Europe, and that will answer your question. Without a modification, a deep modification of the treaty, nothing will change. A previous speaker was talking about two sectors where Europe has taken a kind of leadership: automotive industry and safety, where the Commission and the EU has exclusive competence. The GDPR, again, exclusive competence. So when we have exclusive competence, we can go forward. In health sector, even at the level of certain member states, the health minister in the council cannot take position without having gathering in Belgium. I don't know how many regional ministers. In Germany, the Bundesländer minister, and so on and so forth. One day, under the mandate of Vassiliou, we decided to put a conference with all the health ministers in Europe, 54, or 27 or 28 at that time member states. So the Commission in that context has to support and has to use all the different tools available, not only in the health sector, by the way, because the pharmaceutical legislation for quite a while has been based on the free movement of goods and also the medical devices. But I think that apart from that, and in your paper, you quote the fact that the ECDC has been set up in 2004 under Kyprianou, the head of cabinet, and that the first common procurement for the H1N1 was done in 29, Vassiliou, and was head of cabinet. By the way, the procurement at that time was not the procurement in the meaning of the current procurement today. That was a bundle of national procurement which were carried out at the same times and ended up, according to the same modalities, to the same results. But that was not one single. So there was, of course, a qualitative leap forward. But currently, I think that what ERA is doing, it's something much more efficient. Talking about ERA, because you have touched upon some of the, I would say, institutional changes. First of all, I would like to say that the idea of a vice president for health or well-being, a bit like Skinas currently is the vice president for the European Way of Life, will be, I've been the deputy of Skinas when he was also head of cabinet. So the problem in the current organization of the Commission is that if you have a vice president which is not executive, you don't have the power. You have the power of launching ideas. You have the possibility to promote certain ideas, but being non-executive, you cannot push budget and you cannot push proposals by your own, okay? The fact to transform ERA into an agency, that will be done. And I think that since the beginning, it's the idea for different reasons. ERA, for the time being, I don't know, but it's about 100 and so people. They need much more staff. They need much more qualified staff in certain areas. They need to escape the kind of perimeter of the EU's staff regulation. That means becoming an agency. The money will be given by the parliament, and then they can hire people without being trapped into the different reduction or reallocation of posts within the Commission. But having said that, I see quite a lot of positive development. First of all, we were always saying that receiving patient, the industry, and any kind of groups or stakeholders active in the field of health. We are always saying that we have to differentiate since the beginning and taking into account what is de facto health, the administrative form of health and distribution of responsibility in Europe, what is desirable from what is feasible. And I think that this, just that, is currently evolving in a converging position. That means that we have to find ways not to make feasible everything is desirable, but at least to have a convergent path. The COVID issue has a trigger immense and I guess for the first time an answer from all the different services of the Commission together with the member states because of the economic impact. Be honest. The crisis of COVID was basically stop of all economic activities. So I think it was one of the Prime Minister of Queen Victoria, Disraeli, was saying that if you can have all the weapons in the world, but if you have no health people, all your efforts to grow and to have the country in good shape will be completely vain. So now they have understood that there are, through economic tools, very powerful means which could have also an effect on health. And that the question of the sovereignty. To have the API, pure product produced in Europe. To be honest, when I was on duty, if one day someone had told me that we would be lacking amoxicillin, I would have lost. Because if there is one antibiotic, I think that when I arrived in the pharmaceutical sector, the patent was already gone. So repatriate, relocalize. But then, and this also, the same could be said for all the supply chain, which should be, by the way, monitored more closely by the Commission, and ERA could do that in order to prevent in the future any kind of shortages, or as it is the case now with medical devices, alert that we have put in place a legislation which is absolutely counterproductive, and that if we do not change the new legislation on medical devices, we will have a shortage of very important medical devices, because we have been putting, first we have said that all the, whatever the class, all the medical devices should be reauthorized. According to new criteria, there is a lack of notified body, there is not enough expert, there are bottlenecks everywhere, and at the time, I think now it's 2027, where normally all the medical devices, in particular those in cardiology, will have to be reauthorized, they will not be authorized. Add to that the Parliament is now planning to implement most of the provision of the Artificial Intelligence Act to medical device, in particular those add to diagnosis, but in general, no one knows what will be the criteria. So basically, no one knows for the time being what will have to be put in the dossier to get the reauthorization. So my point is that more and more, through certain review of existing legislation, I'm not talking about the review of the pharmaceutical legislation as such, but I think there are, in the pharmaceutical legislation and in some legislation, there are some provision which should be modified in order to render the pharmaceutical market more smoother. The point also is that we have still in Europe a situation which is quite uncommon in most of the rest of the world, that the marketing authorization is a condition which is needed, but it's not sufficient for the product to be marketed. We still have in Europe, a little bit less since the Brexit, but still, we still have the beverage system of provision of healthcare and what is called the Bismarckian one, which is insurance. And in the middle, France, which is a mix of both. The reopening of the directive on transparency will not fix that, because basically what the transparency directive is saying is that you should tell exactly why you have decided to reimburse or not a product according not to whatever kind of fantasy, but to criteria known and with the possibility to lodge an appeal. One directive which is not quoted in your report, because it's of very little effect, I must say, but I fought for it. It's the cross-border healthcare directive. For different reasons, is not really used, apart from certain region with traditional cooperation between the two parts of the region, which is spreading in two different countries. For instance, some region of the Benelux, some region in Alsace, or in Spain. But there is a spin-off in this directive, which is the HTA network. And I think that in the future, we should pay attention to the development of this HTA network. The Commission will adopt this week implementing regulation in order to put in place the different products which will go through the new HTA network on a mandatory basis. Remember well, there are anti-cancers and some others. And that it's very important because situation like, for instance, I will take a French example, where you have two anti-cancer, which have been authorized by EMA, and which is not available in France because the Haute Autorité de Santé has decided otherwise. Last thing, when we say that we have different system of health insurance, we have also different GDPs. And the availability of a medicinal product is linked to the ability to pay for certain countries. And we will have some example in the future, which will, and the industry has know that, of course, but which could also trigger a reflection on how not to harmonize, of course, the GDP, but to have the possibility to compensate to some extent for very important drug, lack of affordability of certain country. I'm mentioning here, because now it's the star of Novo Nordisk, Wegovy. One Wegovy. It's curing nearly everything, according to the company. Before it was diabetes, now it's for the heart, and you will see tomorrow that will be dementia. Then 1,000 each month get to lost weight. To my knowledge, it's launched in UK, and it's in the EU. It will be launched in Germany, no? Okay.
I think.
Okay. So this kind of product, and you were mentioning gene therapy and all this new technology. All this new product will have, of course, vis-à-vis the Commission, will be a challenge, because the Commission, after the EMA, cannot authorize a product knowing that 2/3 of the countries of the EU will not have access to that product. So maybe a different mechanism could be put in place in order to help certain product to access the market. Finally, back to amoxicillin and the relocalization. Everybody wants the API to be manufactured in Europe. 1 gellule of amoxicillin, API-wise, it's 2 cents of euro. I would like you to give me a company, plant in Europe, under our social law, who can manufacture a gellule of amoxicillin for 2 cents of euro. This means that if you don't want amoxicillin again to be blocked by a ship who did not manage to go through the Suez Canal and blocked everything from India or China, that means that you have to get amoxicillin at least the real price. And for that, member states have to pay. So really like relocalization, budget-wise, has a cost. And when I see a list of the medicinal product qualified as essentials by the EMEA, we need hundreds of new manufacturing plants in Europe. Who will invest? Who will pay? They will not produce that and for free. So the point is that before having a vice president responsible for health, I think that we should plea to have an additional budgetary line in the budget in order for certain situation promote equal access for all the citizens for which kind of medicinal product, for instance, essential ones.
Thank you very much for that intervention and for a wealth of information and knowledge that you provided, reflecting on your own experiences and as well looking forward to what we should prepare for in the years to come. And one thing that you mentioned was that, okay, there are limited competencies when it comes to health at the European level, and that different instruments are used, for example, when it comes to the pharmaceutical legislation. And something that we touch upon in the paper is the link between health and other policy areas, that the role that other policy can play when it comes to health. So Elisabeth, I'm going to ask you now, how can the link between the European Health Union and, for example, EU industrial strategy be improved to bolster Europe's health security and strengthen competitiveness?
Well, thanks for that question, Danielle. And I think we're back at the heart of the matter where Mr. Brunet put it, just also for the sake of discussion that I hope that we're going to have. Because I think here in Brussels, in EU policymaking spheres, I think oftentimes health issues and industrial issues are being seen as separate matters. And I would argue that they're part of the same story. And I think just two examples of the issues that we discussed this morning, I think show you and illustrate what I'm trying to say. If you think about shortages, for sure, that's a public health issue. If you're a patient, you're coming at your pharmacy, you can't get your product. That's a health issue. But equally, as we have seen during COVID-19, when also DG GROW was trying to talk with industry to address the issues of supply chains, securing supply chain in Europe. Clearly, there's more industrial competitive argument to it about attracting the industry to invest in Europe, to ensure indeed that there are the right conditions for the disruptive innovation and innovation in general that you mentioned. But the same goes for joint procurement. For sure, joint procurement is a possibility, I think, especially in the field of rare diseases, ultra rare diseases, for patients to get the medicines they need, and especially these patients in countries where the likelihood of having this ultra rare drug, being available in a certain market where you only would have a few patients is not very feasible. So for patients, yes, it could be an opportunity, but equally for the industry, and it's a very complicated discussion because it touches on the price of product. I think for the industry, joint procurement also could be a possibility to ensure there's a certain volume in Europe, which makes it more interesting for them to invest. Not to think about the fact that also joint procurement could be an instrument to green certain procedures. So again, also in light of the Green Deal, I think there are certain elements that do not only have the public health element, but clearly also have an industrial element. So I think in light of time, the short answer to your question is the pharmaceutical strategy should be seen as a tool to address both health issues as well as industry issues. And I know I've heard DG Santé saying that no, in our opinion, the pharmaceutical strategy is a tool to address public health, but I think that is a missed opportunity. If you think about the regulatory framework, where indeed Europe should be able to compete with other parts of the world, where the EMA should be able to compete with the FDA, so that indeed we have the disruptive innovation that we need, that patients need. I think we should use that opportunity indeed to position the pharmaceutical in a broader perspective. And I know that comes with challenges because I have worked for a Minister of Health at national level. And I know the frustration when indeed we were talking about negotiations with the industry, which is a very national competence, because again, the internal market is very fragmented for pharmaceuticals. There are certain rules, but also having negotiated the transparency directive back in the days, I know very well from my member state perspective that indeed, as a member state, you're not always favorable to European legislation. But again, if you do not do that, and especially in today's world, where the position of Europe and the future of Europe, also in terms of its position on innovation and R&D is at stake, we need to take that more holistic approach. And also member states, if they speak about Zeitenwende and having not business as usual policies at their hands, they should have the audacity to reflect on these challenges. But I keep it at that because I'm very keen also to hear the audience. So.
Thank you very much. And then that does lead us to hear from the audience. So there will be a microphone going around the room. I see we have one question here already and another here. So we can start here maybe with Professor de Mesnier. So you can ask your question. Victoria will pass you the microphone up here. Second row. Nope. Here. There you go.
Thank you very much for all this interesting and challenging introductions. I think that health is key if we want to win the hearts and the minds of the next generations to come for the European Union. So it's not only something that you choose whether you should do that or not. I was in a pharmacy some weeks ago in Greece, and the pharmacist sent me 1 out of 3 medicines is no more available here. Now, that is what the citizen makes the citizen unsure. So we have to tackle that point, and we have to restore so this concept of safety and security in the hearts and the minds of our citizens. And to do that, I think it's important that we put health in the front line, health and well-being and environment. Those 3 have to be seen together and integrated in our approaches, because I think that's really something that you see, and you cannot obscure health. From here, 10 years later, in most of our countries, the people over 85, the number will be doubled. The people living with cancer after treatment, the number will be doubled. So there will be a need for a lot of health care, and we have to make sure that that's available for the citizens, and that we put that forward. Second point is, of course, then where to invest. Many countries say we want to change from hospitals to primary care, but we can't afford the bill of the transition costs. I think Europe there has a huge opportunity to pay for the transition costs, because all the countries have to do that. We cannot continue to do all our rehabilitation in hospitals and so on. It's absolutely impossible. But Europe also should be careful in avoiding to realize more inequity by disease. A lot of patients today say, I have the wrong ticket. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis patients said, sorry, I wish I've got cancer, because then you have all these opportunities, this research and so on. I think this is a very important thing. And when it comes to research, I think we have to go to a kind of delinkage between research and development and investment in that on the one hand, and then the production and sales on the other hand, in order that we can set an agenda for research, for instance, when it comes to new antibiotics in the area of AMR. I think health workforce was mentioned, and it's very correctly, but it's not only a problem of numbers. It's a huge problem of quality nowadays. What we see entering in our country, in Belgium, when it comes to dentists, it's absolutely, you cannot offer that to your population. So I think quality is important. So we have to re-emphasize the importance of accreditation systems. ENCA has to play its role and so on. And the other threat is the commercialization. We see more and more that health practices, dentist practices, but other health practices are bought by investment companies at the multinational level, and local authorities have no force to regulate that. So you can try to do what you want, but if you have a consortium of dentists in your country that's a multinational with international money, and you know that the returns on investment are huge in that sector, you can even no more plan a dental strategy in your country, because it's not you that are going. So Europe is there to take responsibility and to play its role. And then when it comes globally, apart from the geopolitical aspects, I think we absolutely have to re-engage in a new dialogue with Africa. And I think that the integration of climate change, migration and health in our strategy is absolutely needed, because that is what we are going to be faced with. And by the way, the EU should also work together much more with WHO, Europe. In that direction, I think we can make synergy wins and so on. And finally, I think we have to think about a new strategy between EU and the policy in general and the different stakeholders, including industry. I think Europe has to make sure that at the central point of its policy, you have the quintuple aim with sustainable development as the sixth aim to add when it comes to environment. That's important. But also we have to change our strategy. And I would advise to read Mazzucato's paper that she made for the WHO Council on Economics of Health for All, because there a clear strategy is indicated and demonstrated. We have to put at the center the contribution also of industry to the common good, and not only think that competition will bring everything, because I think history shows us that that will not happen. Finally, as the former chair of the expert panel on effective ways of investing in health, I hope that there will be possibility also for independent thinking groups like the expert panel, and we had a positive review and feedback to contribute to independent thinking, so that there is also this kind of reflection, because we need that for development, the future health policy that will win the hearts and the minds of European citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your reflections on the discussion. I think we have another question over this side here.
Thank you for invitation. I would like to be very quick. Three questions. First one, is the right perspective the citizen perspective? May I say we know the gap between West and East concerning health status. If we are Europeans, we have to reduce this gap. We publish about the remaining iron curtain facing cancer, life expectancy, access to treatment. So huge difference between, may I say, East and West Europe. Is the right perspective to reduce this gap? Yes or not? Second one, directly to Philippe Brunet, thank you for your experience. What could be changed in the Lisbon Treaty to enhance or to change collaboration between member states to improve really impact of health policy at European level? And the last one for EPC, do you have some idea how you to imagine new communication with the next EU elected parliament? Because we heard about big changes concerning the composition of this parliament. And perhaps we have to adapt our communication to this maybe next future.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one final question then before going back to the panel.
So obviously we are dealing with people who are most vulnerable when they're sick. We just tackled the issue of the private sector, the private doctors, etc. That's when people are not extremely vulnerable because they have the financial assets in order to be taken care of. However, so we need to take care that the patient's safety and their well-being is our priority. I'm a procurement lawyer, and I noticed that in our procurement documents, we have aspects that actually do not necessarily facilitate our work. The European Commission once again talks about changing the thresholds because we are losing so much time by simply waiting. That also causes that we are not competitive bidders on the market, and that we are simply not interesting for companies when it comes to buying products or pharmaceutical products. Yeah, so that's basically my point. I could say so much more, but I would like to return to the panel.
That's great. Thank you very much. So Elisabetta, I'll first turn to you and maybe put the question that was asked by this gentleman here regarding is it the right perspective we have in trying to reduce that gap?
Yeah, this is a challenge clearly in Europe. There are realities which are very, very different, a different level of capacity in the different member states. And this leads to a situation where in the country where you are born, there may be good availability of innovative products in another country. where you are born, there is unfortunately not that level of, let's say, access to innovation. Certainly there is more that at EU level could be done to help trying to reduce this gap. For me personally, the best way of achieving this would be by looking at the cross-border mobility of patients, which we know it's a challenge because Mr. Brunet was referring to the cross-border health directive. We know that, of course, it has a lot of limitations in terms of facilitating this mobility of patients. And usually the cross-border health directive is for sort of routine treatment, is not for very complex, innovative treatment. For that type of access is more the social security regulation, which is used, where, of course, there is the gap in terms of, payers at national level trying to create not obstacles, I mean, this is not fair, but let's say a level of authorization which can be quite demanding for patients to navigate. And the difficulty is that very often, for example, in the case of certain gene therapies, you need to administer these therapies to patients, to babies, to the patient even before somewhat the disease is manifesting. So you need to have a program of screening, identify the carriers of the defective gene, and then to intervene at that level. How can you use the social security regulation for doing that when you need months and months and months probably to have the authorization? So I think that ideally there could be a role at EU level to really facilitate this mobility of patients, especially in the area of rare diseases, where for me, there is really a role at EU level. The European reference networks have been a success story. Fantastic. I think we have to be very proud at EU level of what we have accomplished with that. Again, an area where, you are really at the limit between competencies at EU level and national level. So I think that there is more to do in terms of enhancing the potential of these European reference networks and how to link them to the national healthcare systems. Because if you are not even aware that there is this level of expertise available in these centers, then you cannot access it. So I would say for me, the best way to address it at EU level will be via this mobility of patients rather than other types of mechanisms.
And then turning to the question, Philippe, that was posed to yourself on what could be changed in the Lisbon Treaty, as briefly as you can be, because I feel like that's quite a big question. And also maybe if you could also quickly reflect on the actual feasibility of that in a short time, as we're running out of time at the moment.
What could be changed? What could be acceptable? Something, I guess, more putting a step-by-step approach in order to fix certain problem. Surely not to give more competence on health to the EU, because you will never get that approved by all the member states. I can give you an example. I think, for instance, that the Commission should be given some competence in order for certain product to monitor the supply chain, and should be given the possibility to help for the relocalization of certain plants. We have money for that. We have done that for through the CHIP Act, and now we are paying for the battery for cars. So if we want to do it for certain active ingredient, you can do it. But we need a piece of legislation. So I think treaty change, I don't know, but surely we can explore some additional legislation on the ground of industrial policy, not on the ground of health.
and highlighting those links that we cannot deny. And Elisabetta, I will quickly come to you for a very quick answer to the final question, as quick as you can be before we wrap up.
And I guess that's the question about joint procurement that you want me to comment on.
Apologies, yes.
I think really in short, but for me, the big issue with joint procurement is that indeed, and I think you hinted at it, the way the instrument is currently designed is that it's still not a centralized procurement. So it's done by the European Commission, and in parallel, it's being done by European member states. And again, I think that's a lovely project in itself that I personally would love to do next. But again, as long as we don't have that, it means it's a very time-consuming procedure. And also for the industry, it's not that interesting because, again, if you can do it in much bigger markets like in the US or in China, and you have that volume already, what's the interest of doing it 27 times in Europe? So I think making it a centralized procurement would be the solution. However, then, of course, we end up in politics because you need the competences for that. So I think we're back at that square. But I think perhaps briefly also to Paul's point, our mission as a think tank is to come up with these aspirations and strategic visions. And it's our mission as a think tank indeed to work with the institutions and to have that dialogue with them for them to pick that up also longer term. So that's exactly what we're doing. We also have an elections task force where we have these discussions, and we're very happy indeed to also perhaps at another event go into more detail on that element.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of our speakers this morning for your intervention and your remarks. I think it was the most interesting discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and also thank you all for being here in the room as well, and for those who posed questions as well. Very much appreciated. So with that, we will bring the event to an end. Please do pick up a copy of the paper on your way out, and of course check out the EPC website as well if you would like it in the digital format. To also say that we will also next week host an event on planetary health where we will publish another paper which will set out our policy recommendations with regard to working towards a more holistic approach to policy making and incorporating a planetary health approach. So thank you very much, and wish you all a lovely afternoon.